Good morning, everyone. My name is Hyun. I'm a partner at March Capital, where I lead our e-commerce enablement strategy. Typically, when I'm mic'd up this early in the morning, I'm at a karaoke joint, not up here talking about e-commerce. But here we are. It's the first time we're having a live panel around e-commerce enablement, and it brings me a lot of joy that it excites you enough to wake up early to come hear us talk. So thank you for joining us today. You won't be disappointed because I have four incredible founders on the stage today who will be discussing market trends, current innovation, top-of-mind themes, and the future of e-commerce. Thank you all for joining. Before we get started, I wanted to go around with introductions and one or two liners on what you are building. Starting from Ben.
We're all going to go karaoke. We're all going to karaoke a little bit later today, so get your game face on.
Great.
I'm Ben. I'm president and co-founder of Octane AI. So quick backgrounder, my original claim to fame in Silicon Valley was the co-editor and editor-at-large of Mashable. I also wrote a best-selling book for HarperCollins called Captivology on the science and psychology of attention. And Octane AI, we power the zero-party data collection in Shopify. So as a consumer, you would experience that by taking a quiz like Find My Fit or Find a skincare routine. And we power that for thousands of Shopify brands. We're backed by General Catalyst and Javelin and a whole bunch of other awesome investors. And just happy to be here this morning.
I have my own mic.
Yeah. Fancy.
Thank you, though. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Violet. And Violet is a middleware API for e-commerce. So you can sort of think about it like Plaid, but for e-commerce, in the sense that we focus almost exclusively on checkout. We, at the end of the day, connect channels and their audiences to merchants and their products. We do that through our Headless Universal Checkout API, so any channel, any application, any experience can implement their own checkout that's natively integrated and connected to any merchant, any e-commerce platform, and facilitate checkout seamlessly across those two entities. So that's kind of been our last 5 years. I've had kind of an interesting path through there. I did not write a book, nor did I work at Mashable, but we've had a pretty interesting run. Our Series A was led by Klarna, so we kind of crossed the gamut between both fintech and e-commerce.
I, too, have my own microphone. I'm Jordan. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Rally. And what we do is offer e-commerce merchants an alternative checkout. And what that means, the way I like to think about it, is that Amazon was the first network that allowed shoppers to buy very easily. Shopify now has their own network in ShopPay, so it is an advantage to be on Shopify and be in that network. But everyone else outside of e-commerce doesn't have that, so we are building what I call the third network with RallyPay. And what makes us unique is that we have a token model that distributes ownership in our network to the merchants themselves based on their contribution, meaning based on how much revenue they process through the checkout. So in effect, what we're building is a merchant-owned e-commerce network.
Hey, everyone. Everyone.
Uh-oh.
Let's get closer.
Closer?
I would offer you to borrow my mic.
Close to the mouth.
Testing. Okay.
There you go.
You're good.
Very close to my mouth. Hi, everyone. I'm Sara, CEO and co-founder of Alloy Automation. We're like a Zapier for e-commerce, so basically the integration layer for e-commerce tools and everything you might use as a brand. So we not only integrate, but also automate your work. So I started this after dropping out of Harvard undergrad. I was there just for about a year, and Alloy has raised about 27 mil from investors like Andreessen and Bain.
Great, thank you. And I wanted to start with a bit of context on where we are in the e-commerce market. In the last 2 years, we saw close to 10 years of e-commerce growth in a very short period of time. But as you guys know, Q1 this year was a little bit slower than what many had expected, down 3% year over year due to inflation, supply chain issues, et cetera. Brandon, I wanted to get your thoughts. If you could walk us through the evolution of buying patterns of consumers in the last couple decades, and segueing that to what you're seeing today, is this a temporary blip, or are you once again seeing a fundamental shift and change in consumer pattern?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if we kind of rewind back, like pre-e-commerce, which is a long time ago, right? So internet starts booming. There's like the first transaction on the internet roughly around like 1995. I think the first transaction was like a pizza, which is usually the case with like internet tests. And from kind of 1995 to 2000, you get the rise of Amazon, right? So you get like a single product aggregator trying to build all of their own technology in-house. And they were the first to really do that. And by the time they do that, early 2000s, Amazon and eBay are starting to grow, and all the other kind of retailers and marketplaces realize, oh, wow, we actually have to figure this out. So they start building all their own tech in-house, and these are like V1 of all of their infrastructure to support that type of buying pattern. Then, kind of from 2005 to 2010, you get the rest of the retailers, like the Nordstroms, and even some of the individual brands continuing to build their own in-house tech stacks. Then things shift right around 2010, where you get the rise of all these e-commerce platforms, right? So in the early 2005 to 2010, you had Demandware, which is now Salesforce Commerce Cloud, and Magento, some platforms you've probably heard of. And by the time you cross towards 2015, you get the era of Shopify and direct-to-consumer purchasing and all the proliferation as a part of that. And so for consumers, they start in like one or two product aggregators, then they start purchasing from retailers, then they go to the D2C, and now they have all kinds of places. Like, I don't know about you, but I have like hundreds of accounts with each individual direct-to-consumer brand. They all have their own website and their own infrastructure. So by the time we get to kind of 2020, you see that like redistribution of those purchases from one single large entity, which is Amazon, down into all these other places, in which marketplaces constitute around 50% of all e-commerce today. Mm-hmm. And so individual brands are selling a lot more, and there's now been this rise of a new category, which is emerging channels. And these emerging channels are right around 9% of total e-commerce today. And this may or may not be a direct-to-consumer brand. This could be a live streaming app. It could be all the different ways now people are discovering products and also trying to purchase them in that location. As a part of that, this leads right into the pandemic, which I think is your point. And what the pandemic did, and I think is true for all of us on stage, is it put a lot of pressure on the e-commerce side of the business. So for the companies that did not update their infrastructure when they probably should have, they now had no choice. They then spent one whole year in a planning cycle with their leadership team saying, we know our in-store sales are going to go down. We now have to figure out e-commerce, or it's an actual existential threat for us. So how do we reprioritize this as a business and shift spend fundamentally over into e-commerce infrastructure? And as a result, you see companies like us saying, yeah, we know these tools are terrible. They've been neglected. This is not your core business today. And in fact, we have tools to solve these problems. We'll happily take your spend and solve those problems for you. So that's what kind of leads to where we're at today. I think the quarter itself, I'm not concerned about. The general trajectory is, very high. People buy things online, and they're going to continue to do more of it. So we'll see what it looks like over time. But generally, that's kind of where we sit, and I think part of why we've all kind of invested our time and our lives in that space.
Yeah, that's great. And Sara, curious to get your point of view on the merchant's perspective. How did they prioritize spend, and how did they utilize technology to meet demand, unprecedented demand from consumers?
Yeah, so we started Alloy probably like 6 months prior to the pandemic, so it was cool to see the shift. I think there were some really interesting things that happened besides the pandemic, like the iOS advertising changes. It got a lot harder to track attributions. So brands, even though they were focusing a lot more on digital, it was really hard to actually do digital well without the right tools, because you couldn't just throw money at Facebook, see where people are coming from, and keep iterating. You actually had to think about, say, customer data, think about your data tools. That is a huge trend we're interested in. Seeing a lot more brands using things like Snowflake, thinking about a CDP, and that's because you actually have to think about how to market across different channels and how to actually focus on LTV versus CAC, since it's not about just acquiring customers, it's about actually retaining them, growing those accounts. So a lot of D2C brands, it's hard to just be this, I think there's this term bland. So bland brands that are well branded by agencies like Red Antler, they don't work anymore because of these changes.
Yeah, it's great. And let's pivot to Shopify and Amazon, Jordan, two names you brought up, and these two platforms account for over 50% of the volume that's transacted in the U.S. today. And these platforms played a critical role in not only reducing friction for merchants to sell online, but creating multi-billion-dollar ecosystem of e-commerce enablement software to enable all these transactions. And I know you've had a fascinating journey to starting Rally. If you could give us a brief background on this journey and how these platforms created an opportunity for you.
Sure. So I'll start by talking about the brand point of view. It's a difficult bargain with the devil that people make in the internet in different areas, right? Social, there's Facebook that dominates, Twitter and all of its drama that we all kind of see very publicly. In e-commerce, it's really Amazon and Shopify right now. And brands have to figure out how to stand out and then also how to deal with what's happening above them at the platform level. So if you sell on Amazon, they find you the customers, right? That's ideal, but you also are making a bargain with Amazon that they're going to see all of your data and all the risks associated. Shopify has been making some movement in the direction of maybe re-aggregating as a marketplace, and so merchants have to think about what that means for them. What Sara was touching on, right? The timing was perfect for brands with the shift online with the pandemic at just the time when optimization and targeting tools were like at their peak. Facebook could find you whoever you needed and efficiently, and people became experts at doing that you could hire, and they would literally just find you customers that you could buy. So you could raise money and buy customers, and that gave you a chance to build a successful brand. The shift in iOS privacy and this slowdown in the economy at the same time is going to wipe out a lot of people, sadly. I think where we're heading is to an Apple advertising network. I think that's inevitable. There's just too much money in advertising, and Amazon literally has all of us in their pocket, maybe vice versa. So all of this privacy push, I think, is to get to 10 trillion as opposed to the current market cap. So I think eventually they'll open up a privacy-centric advertising network, and that'll dominate. So merchants that are at the ground floor have to deal with all of this happening around them, as do companies like our own. My what you called fascinating journey is one way to put it, I guess. I started a company 7 years ago called CartHook, and what we did is offered an alternative checkout system for Shopify merchants because Shopify hadn't yet focused on the checkout the way they have over the last 5 years. And we were able to attract merchants by giving them an alternative checkout with additional features. And we did $100 million in GMV the first year. So clearly there was a very urgent need, right? Just for context, right? This was like a team of 6 people with $500K from friends and family compared to what Fast did, and Bolt is now trying to do also. In total, we processed $2.8 billion at CartHook. 330 million of that came from our post-purchase feature that drew people to us. Unfortunately, Shopify cut our API access and killed the company effectively. So even we have to deal with the platform issues as well. So I think the next 10 years are going to be figuring out from the software point of view, from the merchant point of view, figuring out how to find your spot and protect it without kind of getting run over by these big players.
Ben, I'm going to come to you. You're currently deeply integrated with Shopify. Curious to get your views on whether, and we've talked yesterday about going on to other platforms as well. Curious to get your views on platform risk, if that's ever a concern for you.
So, quick history lesson on Octane because it's relevant to how I think. When we first started the company, we were not the quiz platform for e-commerce. We were chatbots on Facebook Messenger. Celebrities, all that sort of thing. I got some stories with Rick Ross and Maroon 5. You want to find me later. And 30, I have my talk. But Facebook had Cambridge Analytica. I remember this. We were about to launch on Shopify. That same week Cambridge Analytica happened, they stopped the ability to add any new chatbots on the Messenger platform. So we couldn't add new customers for a whole month. And so we had to just go and wait it out. And we were able to go and survive, and our investors made sure that we were in good shape, and we got lucky. But that was a real lesson to my co-founder Matt and I that we had to be, not dependent on a platform. And so Shopify is definitely the bulk of our business. But we've definitely figured out what we're doing is not core necessarily to what they're doing. And so we haven't had any issue of we're going to go and come in on this. And so they promoted us heavily and all those sorts of things. But we're also, in the back of mind, we built a new product that is much more easy to use across platforms. And so there's a whole bunch of new platforms that we'll be adding, both other e-commerce platforms. We can talk about BigCommerce and WooCommerce and all that. But use cases for Octane outside of even just the normal e-commerce use cases or the normal platforms. And there's super interesting stuff to be done there. And so we've started building those things. And so it's always a balance of what's going to get you revenue now versus protecting the long term. But I think you have to just think a lot about what are the priorities of that platform, what's the roadmap over the next 5 years, and you have to think and adjust to that. And it's there's no matter what, for almost every startup, you're gonna have to rely on a platform of some kind. Every mobile app has to rely on either Google or Apple, and we're seeing those kinds of things. So I always think it's about picking your battles and figuring out what the roadmap is for the platform you're working on, and having a deep relationship and getting inside information is really helpful to that.
And Sara, a couple months ago, Shopify launched their own Shopify Flow. Care to comment on what Ben was saying?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. There's always going to be platforms that you as a SaaS company or brand are relying on. And so we're in an interesting place because we're an integration platform. Currently, we connect to about 250 e-commerce relevant integrations across platforms. So not just Shopify, but also Salesforce Commerce Cloud, Magento, BigCommerce. We connect with a lot of ERPs like NetSuite, Acumatica, and the full marketing suite. And so that's going to always be a challenge for us, playing this role of Switzerland. But overall, the way I see it is it's more important than ever to integrate because there's always going to be more SaaS apps. There's, I think, currently 7,000 apps in the Shopify ecosystem. So that means there is overlap with Salesforce's and others. And then obviously more in the Salesforce ecosystem and ones that are unique to BigCommerce. And so there's going to be tens of thousands over the next couple of years. And everyone is building integrations to each other. And so obviously platforms when they close off an API, maybe it's for maintenance, maybe it's for political reasons, and to kill off competitors. But over time, more platforms end up realizing that they can't do things well either. Hence acquisitions like Deliver, kind of roll-ups. I think 3PL Central, Skubana, a couple other 3PLs and WMSs came together recently. And so I do think there's ebbs and flows of it where platforms feel like they have more power and can do that, but ultimately, the trend will always be towards more verticalized, basically more verticalized SaaS apps, because specialized teams can do things much better. So platforms can just, realize that.
Thanks. And I want to talk about a buzzword that's been gaining popularity in the last couple of years, headless commerce. And Jordan, can you help us demystify what is and what isn't headless and why, for you, it's an important infrastructure for the checkout space?
Yeah, so I think I look at headless differently from most people. I think headless right now, when people hear it, most people think of the front end being separate from the back end, and that kind of defines headless. I pretty strongly disagree with the premise that there will always be platforms that are in control, so you have to play ball. I actually don't think that that's true. I think that's the current state of the internet. And I think the promise of Web3, with all its messiness, is that there can be a future where the platform is not in control in that way. The politics of it, the insider of it, the bowing down to what they need and having to think through how they're going to react to a new feature release and are they going to acquire a competitor or invest in them. I don't think that's how the internet has to work. It's just how it works right now. When I think of headless, the promise of headless is a different type of ecosystem where the platform is not the central entity that controls everything and dictates. For me, headless is an unbundling of e-commerce. Shopify and others, Shopify most notably, did an amazing job of bundling that technology and that stack to make it easy. And it gave you the front end where people shop, it gave you the checkout where the transaction happens, it gave you the back end to manage your orders and connect to a third-party app ecosystem. Great, but that's not actually the way it needs to happen. In Shopify, really what they've done is built a platform intended to maximize the flow of transactions through their checkout. That's why they didn't like what we were doing at CartHook, because we were poking them in the business model. But a world where a merchant can decide which front end to use and which back end to use and which services to use and which apps, that ideally can put the merchant much more in control and shift power toward them and away from the platform. In my opinion, and it might be self-serving, but I think it's true, the key is the checkout. The key is the transactions. If you separate the checkout from the platform, the incentives around it change. So for me, headless is not more control over the front end. Control over the front end is where it begins. Where it leads to is a very different looking e-commerce landscape 10 years on.
Got it. And Brandon, is this different from API-driven commerce? And also, there have been countless attempts at building a universal checkout platform. How is your approach different?
Yeah. So I think first thing to note is maybe what headless commerce is preventing. So as opposed to what it does, what is it actually preventing? And the thing it prevents is being locked in from a technical perspective in which changes on the back end require changes on the front end. So decoupling those two technically give teams all kinds of choice. So you've probably heard of Nacelle, Shogun, Builder, all those that like really are trying to advance on the front end side, and that's great. And there's others that are trying to advance on the back end side, and they can now start to specialize as well. There's the companies like Swell and Fabric and all these back end specific companies out there. And generally, headless itself is a technical phrase to have to do with just the decoupling of front end and back end. All that means. Now for us, we are, of course, interested and think it's amazing that technical teams that work inside of a merchant's engineering team now has flexibility. So they can choose their own stack, they can make customizations, they might even be able to run it in their own hosted environment, whatever they want to do. That's great. The other thing that does, though, that we think is interesting is, as a merchant, you no longer have to then be locked in to just your individual website. Ideally, if you have a headless infrastructure where that API can now connect into a bunch of other channels with different surfaces, different audiences, very niche experiences. Think, a live streamer that is really into skiing gear and wants to give a review of a certain pair of goggles, and they're on a chairlift somewhere and talking about, like, look at this, it's not fogging up, and here's the product, click right now to purchase. And when they purchase, that actually sends an API request to their back-end system. Doesn't touch their front end whatsoever, sends like JSON response, like very technical here, to them, and it all processes just as if it was an order from their website. All of a sudden, they have really high intent channels, a lot of access to those environments, and in large part, it is almost only possible through API-driven or headless commerce. And so for us, that's super interesting as we think about where the next series of purchases and environments are going to exist where people want to buy products. Now, to your second part of your question around people having tried to build universal checkout, I think there are a lot of things that are different in the technical landscape that make this a unique moment. When people originally tried this, most of these e-commerce platforms were not headless. They did not have the kinds of APIs they have today. We also didn't have the opposite side of this equation, in which there was a very rich innovation ecosystem of companies trying to build really cool new apps and experiences. And I think you can even see, the Asian market and how they're evolving big time in live streaming purchases, conversational commerce, and all these new paths. So, our kind of fundamental premise is we as a company can't ever build the one front end interface that's going to solve everyone's problems and be the most creative place to ever go, but that instead, if we can sort of abstract out a lot of these platforms into a headless universal checkout, we think the creativity and opportunities for anyone to build whatever they want with a universal checkout is much more interesting. And so technically, of course, we've made some really strategic choices to do that. We've made a lot of mistakes in prior companies that have informed that now. But at the end of the day, it's to empower that next phase of e-commerce.
Yeah. And let's zoom out a little bit. I think the birth of companies like yours really speaks to the innovation in the e-commerce world in the last couple of years. And there seems to be a bit of a dislocation in the technical sophistication of the average merchant and the dependency on these technology platforms. And Ben, if you could lay out for us what the complications are of a merchant dealing with in this current landscape.
So one thing, because the headless debate is one that's dominated the e-commerce conversation over the last few years. One big difference for most merchants compared to like your traditional software company is that they just don't have that many people on their teams oftentimes. Like, it was crazy to me when I learned how few people worked at, say, like Kylie Jenner's brand. It's like in the tens. And you can run a $500 million business with just a few people because you can use all of these other services to do everything from shipping and everything else. And the core competency of a merchant is not technology. It's physical product. And so why would we expect, merchants, except for the largest ones, or like the mid-sized ones where they can really hire engineers and all those sorts of things, to be super competent on those things. That's why they turn to technologies like ours to help them like build that back-end infrastructure. And what you see if they don't work with a partner or a group of partners, that technology gets stale and gets old and is difficult to go and update. And you can see some legacy stuff from like 20 years ago still around that you're just like, why does it work this way? And it takes some hours to go and do, which is why there's been a lot of replatforming to different places. So like smallest merchants don't have any engineers. They're gonna, they're gonna use platforms that can get them up and running. That's why Shopify is so popular. But we are definitely starting to see like, you're getting to a certain size, like maybe 5 million in revenue, something like that. You might be like, there's some specific things you want to go and do where like, even a couple percent increase in load speed is going to increase like your conversion rate by a significant amount, which is where you start turning to like, one of the big benefits of Headless is another example is being able to like just load things more quickly because it's decoupled. Yep. So the complication really comes down to their primary competency is not technology. They often rely on agencies. They rely on technology partners. And there's like a whole like pro and con to that. And there's only a few I can actually name that are like really like have a real strong focus on technology. And like the truth is too, like we can like there's examples of companies where they put their eye off the ball on their physical product, and that hurt them when they were trying to do other stuff on the technology side. Really, in the end, they need to focus, and they want to focus on the product itself. And so that's where the complication, because they're not built as software companies. They're built as physical product companies.
Got it. Thank you. And Sara, Alloy is a platform that's easy for anyone to use, whether that's founders, operators, marketers, engineers. Tell us the role of no-code, low-code in what you've built and the role that it plays in the future of the tech stack.
Yeah, so kind of to add to Ben's point first, I think when you're building a brand, you're not setting out to build an engineering org. You're setting out to build a physical product or maybe something digital, but a brand, right? So that's marketing, creative, all of that. I've never met like an engineer from Meta or Tesla that wants to work at a brand, and the only time I did meet one was like some guy, his wife pulled him into it. And so basically like brands have always brought in agencies, so agencies are pushing the headless trend. And for the longest time, like these past couple years, we saw a lot of agencies doing like even the Klaviyo build-outs, so like email setup, SMS, like those are not that technical. But given this downturn especially, you can't just throw bodies at problems anymore. So I think that's a bad habit that brands are starting to get out of. And with no code, I think people are realizing that you actually don't need to be technical and you can set up a lot of this tech yourself. Obviously, Headless is far from that, but a lot of things like even Klaviyo has like a flow builder. For us, it's like a if this then that workflow building tool. And so I think overall, we're seeing a lot of brand owners and people who work at brands get slightly more technical, just like the rest of the population. And I think that'll be beneficial for kind of moving into like this digital age.
Yeah, that's great. And let's briefly touch on data. Two topics come to mind as it relates to e-commerce, movement towards a cookie-less future, which results in less accurate data. And the second is data privacy, which results in less accessible data. And so, Brandon, how are API companies like yourself preparing for a privacy-first, cookie-less future?
Yeah, I can kind of speak to at least what we've heard from customers and where people are trying to go. And again, I think Violet generally as a company focuses on the channels. I'll leave kind of the merchant discussions to the other folks here. But when we talk to channels, they are obviously trying to generate more revenue for merchants. That's their job, right? They're advertising companies, and they now are restricted and trying to figure out what to do next. And they don't have a lot of choices. And what they're trying to now figure out is, well, we know that as a channel, they generate interest and they facilitate discovery. And if they can't then put the right link in the right place, they then, instead of sending the actual shopper from their channel back to the merchant site, they're trying to figure out how do they take the merchant and move their products and their checkout into their environment. Because in their environment, you can have a logged in user, you can have past orders, you can know what you want to surface to them at the right place, and most importantly, there's no confusion about a conversion. You know if they purchased from inside your application. So I think the whole equation is being challenged for people to say, is this the only way to do it? Are we going to continue to run our business centered around a set of links that have some sort of like reference ID that we have to try to track through a series of steps within a checkout somewhere else? Or can that checkout actually live inside of our experience? And merchants actually love that. I think there's a lot of data sharing conversations that end up sort of popping up in there. But generally, shoppers want to buy the things that they're looking at. The channels themselves have a lot to gain and benefit from. It increases the overall kind of tracking of the conversion itself. So that's the route that we see people moving. Whether or not that everyone does that remains to be seen. But generally, I think that's kind of where you'll see stuff that'll move into those environments themselves.
Got it. And as regulation around data gets tighter, personalization gets tougher, which results in rising ad costs. And Ben, how does your platform help combat all of that?
So first of all, thank you, Apple. That helped. The change was not great for a bunch of people, but it really did help us. So how our platform generally works is like they're going to use our platform to build a quiz or a conversational pop-up or something where it asks a key set of questions like what kind of skin do you have, what kind of colors you're looking for, what kind of skin conditions you have, or if it's in like a baby brand might be like what's the age of your baby, like what's male or female, all those sorts of questions. For us, it was what we saw was as soon as iOS 14.5 dropped and people started opting out of data tracking, the average return on ad spend dropped by over 40%, which is like devastating for e-commerce brands because that was the majority way they brought people in. And so they've been looking for solutions on how to go and like change that. And so there's a couple of factors. One, you've got to go and future-proof yourself as an e-commerce brand. You do that by having your own data set that you own because you've been relying on a third-party data set, Facebook's data set or someone else's data set, and you diversify like your channels and you increase the way that you get conversions. So as a very specific example of something that has really helped our business in the last 3 months in particular, Bobbi Brown, the famous makeup artist, has a skincare brand, Jones Road Beauty, which is, as I've learned, the #1 fastest growing D2C brand in the world right now. And so they shifted a lot of their Facebook ad spend to TikTok and to TikTok ads, and they send all of that traffic not to here's like a landing page or to here's like a product page, but to an Octane AI quiz where they ask these questions about skin and all that, and then they ask for an email, and they use that information to personalize the first email they send out. They use that to capture a lot more emails so they don't have to run retargeting ads if people bounce. And for them, it resulted in a 3.5 to 4x return on ad spend. They make 7 figures every single month from like their quiz. They collect over 100,000 emails every month. And now we have a lot of other brands that are trying to do the same kind of thing because they're trying other channels. They want to improve their conversions, and they want to collect data that will help them future-proof themselves so that they can have this data set to do personalization on the website, to do personalization over email and SMS. And it's just every single time you even do just a little bit of personalization, it just creates a multiple on your revenue. And now especially with things getting tighter and things getting maybe like more difficult, everything that can help in conversions even a little bit, whether it is increasing site speed or making your apps talk better or having more of your own data is essential for an e-commerce brand, a D2C brand, a retail brand today.
Great. Now let's relate e-commerce to the rest of the tech world, and clearly a lot of buzz around crypto, blockchain, metaverse, etc.
Crypto!
Easy, Ben. Jordan, talk to us about what is relevant versus not in the e-commerce world specifically.
Around all those topics, it's been pretty noisy in e-commerce overall.
Yep.
It's been pretty noisy in tech, in VC. It's just been noisy. We had this very strange situation where our 2 biggest competitors were Fast and Bolt. So it was literally the loudest space on Twitter. And we were looking at it like, what is happening here? And then one goes out of business, and one's having very different issues. I think they just announced layoffs today. It's kind of hard to keep your head. I feel like as founders right now, we need to keep some balance. We want to focus on customers, but you also have to acknowledge the environment. You have to keep an eye on your funding. You have to think about being aggressive at the same time while everyone else is in trouble. So it's a mixed landscape. Blockchain and crypto, as we all know, very noisy, pretty messy right now. I think Andreessen just announced another $4.5 billion crypto fund. So they're kind of going where the puck is, in my opinion, especially when everyone else is backing off. I think all of this starts to converge. If I think about what Brandon was talking about in different channels, different environments, that separation, right? I get a kick out of the e-commerce website is this funny analogy to the offline world. Is literally the homepage is your storefront.
Yep.
The category pages are your aisles. The product page is looking at the product, and you literally put it in a cart and go to a checkout line. It's kind of ridiculous. But it stayed that way because it worked, and now it's really being challenged because you don't want to send all forms of traffic to the same product page just so they can go through the cart and the checkout. It's not actually necessary anymore, which is what a lot of us are working on. So if you think about these new environments, you think about Sandbox, Decentraland, Fortnite, eventually where there are audiences, retailers and merchants are going to want to be. So right now, the idea of selling your product inside of Sandbox and asking the user to click on a button and leave and go to a website and start adding something to the cart, it's just not going to happen. So all of these things are going to start to play with one another, including identity and tracking. So there are ways where you can make purchases and convey the information required for that purchase in complete privacy. Right now, the funny thing about checkouts is it's literally like one of the dumbest interactions. It's literally a form field that I have to tell you, here's my first name, here's my last name. And I already know all that stuff. It should be very easy to just kind of tap a finger and say, here's my stuff that you need, and then only you get it, and I get to determine in what way that's used or not used. So all of these things are just swirling in this very, very messy storm right now, which is exciting. It's a lot of opportunity, but as Ben was alluding to, there's a lot of challenges for brands. And they're figuring things out. It's great that Octane is one of these solutions that helps them in this world. So all these brands have a very difficult challenge right now, and hopefully tools like ours help make their lives better.
And Brandon, on the topic of metaverse, do you think that'll be a major e-commerce channel in the future where people will shop?
Yeah, absolutely. We try to sort of focus that question down into e-commerce around digital goods or virtual goods versus the sale of physical goods and what that'll look like in those virtual environments, right? So the digital ones and the virtual ones, that's pretty easy. There's kind of, infinite supply, or at least like fungible supply to some degree. You can limit it if you want. Jordan would help definitely there from a checkout perspective. But like Violet's not as useful in that component because you can move that data around pretty easily. What's a lot more difficult is, getting all the way down to thinking about the various SKUs that a merchant's going to want to have live inside of a metaverse environment. And when someone is walking through, maybe they're in a showroom. A lot of these retailers are trying to build virtual showrooms. They're now building out like whole sections inside of these virtual worlds that are all around like Nike or Air Jordan or whatever. And if you think about the use case in which someone buys both a virtual good and that matching pair of Jordans that needs to show up on their doorstep 3 to 5 days later, when they do that, the digital good's relatively easy to purchase. You have like a 3D object that sits somewhere. It probably has an ID. Maybe it's a SKU ID, maybe not, but it has an ID. You can buy that, own it. It goes somewhere inside of a database. But then when you go to buy that actual physical pair of Jordans, that metaverse company isn't going to have necessarily what size is in stock, what color's available, what's the SKU ID, what platform is that coming from. And at the point in which that purchase happens, it has to then go somewhere else to kick off the fulfillment process. And so that, metaverse company, and even in some ways, augmented reality, we also look at closely as well, they're going to have to figure out, are they going to go build all these integrations? Are they going to try to figure out how to manage inventory or have physical product or not? We think pretty heavily the answer is going to be no, but that you should be able to buy all these physical products in these virtual environments. And to do that, there's a massive kind of data layer here that's unsolved, around which we also, think about this in a very like forward-looking way and have, 3D objects inside of our API and all the different ways that actual metadata has to get exchanged back and forth for this to happen. But like today, it is literally not possible. Like it just doesn't work. So I'd say we haven't seen a lot of that yet, but it will happen over time. And we sit very low in like the plumbing layer here and talk about like passing SKU IDs, et cetera, but definitely think it's going to be a big part of the future.
I just would say that we've already been, like, metaverse is almost a rebranding of stuff that's been happening for years. Like, you think about like how deep the world of Roblox is, or of Minecraft, or things like that, and like in-app purchasing was like pioneered like 7-8 years ago by Apple, and they're about to come out with some fancy AR headset, as rumors would go and say. And I have seen, as a ex-reporter, every single time Apple releases something, they take extra years to get it done, but they build an entire ecosystem around that. And so the behavior's already there. We already have like our own little metaverses. It's almost just a rebranding what we're doing.
Totally.
And so like, yeah, the physical side of it is like the more nascent part, but that's also something that like, people already know how to go and do purchases like in whichever miniature world that they're in. It's just a rebranding of stuff that we've already been doing.
Yeah.
Thanks for that color. And just to wrap this up, there are a lot of investors and other entrepreneurs out at the summit today. Any big trends we should be excited about or be on the lookout for, Sara?
Yeah, I mean, I'm Gen Z. I love Web3, but I honestly think Web2 infra still sucks. So all of us here are kind of fixing that first before we get into the next version of the web. And so I personally, I think a huge problem is still like merging identities of consumers, like whether they purchase in person and then digital. Most brands cannot tell if it's the same person, which is crazy. So we need to do that before you can have the anonymous layer, all of that. And so tools that kind of address that are like data warehouses, data pipelines, super boring stuff, but stuff that needs to be in place in order to create like the next type of consumer experience for brands.
Brandon?
Yeah. I'm actually going to go a slightly different direction. So if we think about what's broken in e-commerce, we can talk about technology all day long, but I actually think our language is broken around this. I think too many companies are using the same language over and over again to mean different things. And so it's very, very tough for us to say, I do this, and they're like, well, are you just like this company? And the answer is no. And so, my hope is, as we continue to advance forward and innovate in the space, we come up with new language to articulate the differences between categories, and would encourage kind of all of us to go like 2 or 3 layers deeper to understand how those things are different, how that helps those customers, and like kind of cleans up that landscape.
Yep.
Maybe a little bit of like a hobby horse for me, but like I'd love it if we really kind of advance the language around these tools as things progress.
Yeah. Jordan?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we were laughing about yesterday, where speaking to investors, you have to suss out the knowledge level that you're talking about. And what I do when I pitch, I go to screen share within like 5 minutes because the words are confusing, and you really want to be able to make sure you're on the same page. Because e-commerce is, it's wide now. So when people compare us to a competitor, we really have to identify, these aren't the feature differences. This is like the worldview difference. But it's great to come across investors who are deep in it and curious about it and get it. I think the challenge now is bravery. Everyone's scared.
Yeah.
And what will separate people are, how long are you going to sit back, or are you going to lean in, or how much risk are you going to chew on?
Great. Yeah. Ben, finish us off.
I think it's important for us to zoom out of what's happening quarter by quarter, because if we look at like this quarter sucked for lots of people. And so you can come with very specific conclusions about that. But like if you look at the broader trend, is e-commerce going to continue to grow as like a way people buy? Yes. Are people going to buy more things in virtual worlds and things? Yes. And like, retail will still be a part of that. Like I remember this conversation with Jen Rubio of Away, where every time they launched a retail store, they'd have a huge increase in e-commerce sales around them because people would look at the thing, go back home, go buy from there. It like worked as a billboard. And so they would work more seamless together. But the thing that you need to make it all seamless together is what Sara was talking about, which is data. Yeah. And so, data collection, data analysis, data processing, the brands that really invest in that are going to be in much better position over the next couple of years, because for sure there will be a bunch of more brands that fall off the map or get rolled up by one of the 600 roll-ups that are rolling out. And like consolidation is a natural part of what happens in potential down markets, but the brands that have that data and and can get through it are going to be in incredible shape, because the long-term trends are in their favor, they're in our favor, they're in everyone's favor here.
Perfect. Thank you all for joining today. And 4 founders will be around for the next 24 hours, so please come say hi and have a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.